everyone. Greetings from County Kilkenny in Ireland. I am very pleased to be able to participate in this initiative that's being coordinated by Jessica Holloway. When I was first invited to speak to this and I saw the other names on the list, I immediately noted that I was in very good company. So I'm also very excited to seeing the contributions of others too. What I'm going to speak about now is some research that I undertook and published in Research Papers in Education. The full title of that paper is Irish Migrant Teachers' Experiences and Perceptions of Autonomy and Accountability in the English Education System. Now, this research set out to document the experiences and the perceptions, as the title suggests, of a largely under-researched group of teachers in England. It looks at how the hegemonic discourses surrounding professional culture in England have played out in their lives, continue to play out, and their hopes, desires, and fears for the future. Now, in doing this, the research also makes a valuable contribution to the literature in that it adds to the existing scholarship about how powerful policies and discourses are received by teachers in schools. Now, to start us off and set some context, and I'm sure some of you are already familiar with the English education system and its workings, but for those that are not, the English system is widely regarded as being one of the most high stakes in the world. It's one of increased top-down control, increased regulation, and it's one in which is driven by the fear of sanctions. Schools operate in this competitive market. They are policed by an external inspectorate known as Ofsted. They have their examination results compiled and published in football-style league tables, and then they ultimately compete for students based on their performances and the reputations they gain based on those performances. Parents are to make use of information about schools that is made publicly available to them, and they use that information to decide where to send their children. So schools compete for students or customers. It's a system driven by per capita funding from the government. So the more students you can bring into the school, the better. While on the other hand, if a school is deemed to be underperforming, they often have the head teachers or other members of the senior leadership team removed and replaced, while in more extreme circumstances, schools can actually be closed down. So there is a lot at stake for both the schools and the staff members in those schools, depending on how they perform on external measures. And the consequences of having a system that's held together by high stakes testing and high stakes inspections is that the pressure schools face gets passed down the line. Stress trickles down into the classrooms of teachers and into the lives of teachers. Teachers' daily lives come to revolve around the demands of performance and the demands of competition, and their lives become controlled through monitoring, supervision, and the constant gathering of knowledge and data about how effective they supposedly are or are not. They become victims of performativity. Performativity is a regime of accountability that judges teachers through different means according to different criteria and renders them constantly recordable and constantly accountable. So in this low trust regime of increased accountability, the work of teachers comes to be organised around dominated by targets, evaluations, appraisals, benchmarks, rankings, comparisons. And within all of this for teachers, there's an increase in workload. There's more paperwork that has to be documented. There's more surveillance. They're watched intensely internally by the senior leaders in their schools. So the schools in England become highly pressurised and stressful working environments. Now, this isn't to say that all teachers in England struggle in these environments, and I will come back to that in a moment, but there is a wealth of research and particularly qualitative studies that does show the negative effects that all of this hyper accountability can have on teachers. The theory that guided this research was one of post-structural thinking. Although that's not explicitly communicated in the paper, perhaps it should be more than implicitly implied. But it builds on a previous paper I published in Policy Futures in Education about teacher identity. And teacher identity is understood here as being the way a teacher sees his or herself as a professional, what they constitute and consider to be a professional. And the identity that a teacher has is based on their previous experiences of education. So based on, for example, the thousands of hours, countless hours they've spent in classrooms as students when they were in school themselves, watching their own teachers, experiences they might have from pre-service programs or any past professional experiences they might have acquired. So when you factor in how an identity is formed and shaped, if you take a teacher coming from Ireland, such a marketised, business-like, accountability-focused school system, that's likely to present many challenges for a teacher coming from Ireland, given the sharp contrasts that exist between the Irish system and the English system. Now, we do know that teachers in England, they do, of course, many of them struggle. They can be overwhelmed and stressed with workload and pressure, and their motivations to teach, the values they hold, they can be challenged. Their whole beliefs about education and how they believe education should be experienced can be challenged. The English education system over time has gradually eroded and displaced the ethic of care that we associate with traditionally underpinning the teaching profession. What's important now, essentially, in this education system is what can be quantified or calculated or measured and ranked, given the importance based on the reputations of schools and the reputations of teachers within schools. To be seen to be doing good becomes just as important, if not even more important, than actually doing good. And it's been like this in England now for over 3 decades. So you've got 3 decades worth of discourses have normalised this, and teachers have been socialised into a particular mode of thinking. We now have generations of teachers in England who've gone through this system as students. They've gone through it as pre-service teachers. So this is the education. This is the type of education that they know, the type of education that they expect. They don't know any different. So the way teachers now think about education, the way they talk about education, the way they understand education, that has changed significantly over the last 3 decades. So essentially, I would contend that neoliberal discourses and policies, what they've effectively done is poison people's whole concept of education, what it's about, what it's for, its role, its purpose. So I'm not proposing that Irish teachers struggle in this environment while it's a matter of English teachers thriving. It's not as simple as that. We do know that English teachers can struggle too, but Irish teachers are more likely to experience school life more negatively in England, given their experiences and their knowledge of the profession in Ireland, which is more autonomous, more trusted, and far less competitive. So what did the research actually find? The Irish teachers that I spoke to, they were very critical about life in English schools. To start off, they felt that the accountability that they were subjected to far outweighed any autonomy they had. They felt that they were constantly watched, constantly recorded, and constantly accountable. And we see here as well the various tools and techniques that schools in England will use to monitor teachers, to govern teachers, to discipline teachers. And within all of this accountability, there does come an increased workload for teachers. There's a lot of paperwork and documentation required of them. And this is something that the participants felt was very overwhelming and unsustainable. And given the time that was required of them in order to complete said tasks, they felt that it eats into all aspects of your life. There simply is no work-life balance. So because they're overworked, because they're stressed, I also found a lot of negative emotions, largely due to what the participants felt were the unsupportive and highly judgmental natures of the management teams in their schools. They felt that they were scrutinised and criticised in very judgmental and critical ways, as opposed to any supportive ways. And at times there was a real, genuine sense of fear on their part. They spoke with fear, a fear of being inspected by school leaders, having their classroom practice observed, and a fear of having their documentation and paperwork examined. This created a real sense of fear, and they're aware of the consequences of falling foul of management. If they're considered to be underperforming or potentially posing a risk to future inspection results, they are likely to be moved on somewhere else. So they were very aware of that and very critical of the management teams in their school. Now, as negative as the participants were, and they were very negative, they directed a substantial amount of criticism towards Ofsted, the inspectorate. They saw Ofsted as being the source of all their problems. They felt that if Ofsted judged something, then schools would value it. They felt that schools were doing things, ticking boxes and jumping through hoops for the purpose of impressing the inspectorate, regardless of whether certain initiatives and practices had, if they were in the best interests of the students in that school. So there were some very strong perceptions among the participants about the motivations of English schools and the priorities of English schools. They saw English schools as engaging in a culture of self-interest, as opposed to looking after the people in that school. They felt that the schools were prioritising the needs of the institution ahead of the needs of the students and the teachers in that school. And then consequently, because all of this, the participants reported experiencing some form of identity clash or identity crisis. Some teachers disclosed that they would behave in a certain way because they knew that they were always being watched. Others talked about how they would look for shortcuts in their work, adopt some type of coping strategy that would try and reduce the workload. And they spoke very openly here, very frankly, very candidly, and they were very aware that they were engaging in practices that went against their values and their beliefs about education, and that they were not giving students the best possible service in the classroom. And this, I felt, was articulated excellently by one participant in particular, a female participant who, in her own words, said that the students were not the main concern anymore. And this participant, I thought this was really interesting because we see here a real sense of guilt and shame attached to her story. She really seemed to resent what she had become, but she justified the strategies that she was adopting. She justified them based on her own vulnerable position in a high-stakes accountability system. And I'm just very briefly going to read out a quote from this participant. She says, "What I went into teaching for was to be with the kids. I wanted to help them, and at the end, I know this sounds horrendous, but the kids actually became an inconvenience. They were getting in the way of everything else I needed to do. At the end of the day, I was being judged as well. So I was marking the kids' work, but my work was being marked by senior leadership. So I was still a student." So at this point, you would be forgiven for thinking, please say something positive. The paper, it is a very bleak read, and perhaps a tad more negative than if it had been a group of non-Irish teachers interviewed. I will say that they were remarkably consistent and similar in their messages, and it does dovetail with other literature and with other pieces of research. Or even I'd go as far as to say, in this age of social media, and I'm sure if you're watching this video online now, you also have access to the teachers on social media platforms who despair about hyper accountability, unsustainable workloads, critical managers, stress, pressure, toxic school cultures. And of course, we do also see these entrepreneurial teachers who are more accepting of and embracing of this way of being. But I think based on this research and the existing scholarship, what we see online through social media platforms, perhaps it is now time for a genuine rethink of how English schools, how they operate, how they function. But we should probably start first of all by addressing from the top with the inspection system and the inspectorate, which puts enormous stress and pressure on schools. As the participants in this research felt, that's the source of all the problems. That's where the problems are stemming from. And I would say that I do find it rather unsettling, but perhaps not surprising, that at a time when I, like many others around the world, am working from home during these very challenging times, the inspectorate in England are still subjecting schools to these very high stakes inspections that have far reaching consequences for those involved in the inspections. Now, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up and leave it there. I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and perhaps if you haven't done so already, you might read the full paper in Research Papers in Education. So thanks very much for listening. I am looking forward to seeing others' contributions too. So mind yourself and stay safe